Good evening, everyone, or morning for those who are joining us from Asia. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, based here in Ottawa. It is my great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and timely discussion on the challenges and opportunities facing the Indo-Pacific region. This session will be focusing in particular on infrastructure development, trade, and the future of economic governance. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our supporters, audience members, and guests today for joining this conversation. We have a real standout cast of speakers to join us this evening from all over the world, joining us from Tokyo, Singapore, Montreal, and Ottawa. This is the second event as a part of MLI's new Canada the Indo-Pacific initiative, which will commit a great deal of our efforts in the coming months to look at this pivotal region and its importance for Canada. We hope you continue to join our future events and read our work on Canada's strategic imperative to understand and organize its engagement in this region. Simply put, infrastructure development is sorely needed in the Indo-Pacific region to sustain growth amongst large and mid-sized economies alike. The Asian Development Bank estimates that more than $25 trillion will be needed by the end of this decade. As the G20 noted under Japan's chair in 2020, infrastructure is a driver of economic prosperity and provides a solid basis for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. Nonetheless, the world still faces a massive gap in financing for investment in new and existing infrastructure, which could generate a serious bottleneck to economic growth and development. The Indo-Pacific region also continues to evolve when it comes to trade and the importance of supply chains. Economic governance and trade are also key measuring sticks for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. The CPTPP, or TPP-11, has now been put in force, and further steps in terms of trade policy are sorely needed to be discussed. In addition to the TPP-11, another regional trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, was signed last year. I'm sure our panelists will dive deeper into these issues more today. Importantly, Canada has an opportunity to join the United States, Japan, Australia, European countries, and others in proposing a sustainable trade and investment strategy based on fair lending, transparent institutions, and long-term growth. To shed light on these issues, MLI is delighted to convene this session with a range of regional experts to discuss infrastructure development and trade in the Indo-Pacific, and what role Canada might play in these shifting dynamics. On that note, let me begin by saying we are delighted once again to welcome to our platform Japan's ambassador to Canada, His Excellency Yasuhisa Kawamura. Japan continues to be not only a key friend and partner for Canada in this region, but also an essential proponent of strong economic governance, trade integration, and infrastructure development. I'd like to hand the virtual floor over to Ambassador Kawamura, but before doing so, I'd like to briefly introduce him. Before coming to Canada, Ambassador Kawamura served as ambassador and deputy representative of Japan to the United Nations between 2017 and 2019. He has also served in a range of senior roles in Japan's foreign ministry, including as press secretary and director general for press and public diplomacy. Ambassador Kawamura is also one of Japan's most seasoned diplomats, with overseas postings in New York, Delhi, Indonesia, Brussels, and elsewhere. He continues to be a good friend to me and a strong proponent of strengthening Japan-Canada relations, both on the official track, but also through his robust and keen engagement with public policy institutes such as the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which we are eminently grateful. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Good evening and good morning, everybody, on and behind the screen. One of the things that I do want to avoid these days is not to start my talk by referring to COVID. But unfortunately, I think I have to start it with COVID again tonight. Looking over the past year, COVID-19 has not only brought health threat to the world, but also accelerated the world division, in which the rule-based international order has been challenged. The government of Japan has been emphasizing the importance of multilateralism and leading efforts towards international unity and cooperation in order to realize a world respecting the fundamental values and the rule of law, especially with regard to Japan advocated free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Japan and Canada, which have the Pacific Ocean in between them, share values including the rule of law and free trade, and have been working for the realization of such values, for example, through close collaboration in the G7. In recent years, Japan and Canada strengthened their collaboration both in security and economic areas. For example, through cooperation in monitoring the ship-to-ship transfer, which is illegal in terms of the United Nations Security Council resolution by North Korea, and enacting the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, as you may know. Our two prime ministers also agreed to enhance our country's strategic partnership under FOIP vision. The Indo-Pacific region accounts for 50% of the world population. The region, which also connects strongly with Africa, has been the center of the world economic growth. The prosperity and stability of the region will have a direct impact on the prosperity and stability of the world. The rise of unilateralism was seen internationally even before the COVID-19 crisis. Facing such a move, Japan realized the importance of enhancing a free trade regime and made an effort to conclude CPTPP with 11 member states in the Indo-Pacific region in 2018. CPTPP is the high standard and well-balanced rule suitable for the 21st century. CPTPP, for example, prohibits non-commercial assistance by state-owned enterprises, which would cause adverse effect or injury to another party, and prohibits data localization requirement for electronic commerce. It also includes a strict regulation to address counterfeiting and piracy. CPTPP aims to promote such high standard and well-balanced rules in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world. In that sense, interest shown by many economies in CPTPP are a welcoming move, as it shows CPTPP is highly valued. The government of Japan, as the chair of CPTPP this year, will closely look at such interest of non-member economies. Japan considers it is important to commit to the high standard rules of CPTPP while also securing steady implementation and a possible expansion by taking into account strategic points of view. COVID-19 shut down the global supply chain in its early stages, for example, by export restrictions and border closures. This made the enhancement of a free trade regime and resilient supply chain even more important. As Japanese Prime Minister Suga repeatedly mentions his determination to facilitate economic order based on free and fair rule, even in the COVID era, the government of Japan signed Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the UK last October and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, last November with 15 Asia-Pacific countries. RCEP is the Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes countries with different systems and different economic sizes. Although it differentiates itself from CPTPP in its member states, backgrounds, and conditions, it is a meaningful agreement from the standpoint that it includes the rule for intellectual property and electronic commerce. It improves market access for goods and services, and its member states account for 30% of the world trade volume as well as population. In the post-COVID-19 era, where we will see more remote work and digitalization, it is also important to make new rules to create a business environment where cyberspace would be protected and companies would be able to conduct business at ease. Canadian Centre for Cyber Security pointed out in its National Cyber Threat Assessment 2020, the number of cyber threat actors is rising, and state-sponsored actors will almost certainly continue to conduct commercial espionage against businesses, academia, and governments to steal intellectual property and proprietary information. At the G20 Osaka Summit, Japan launched Osaka Track, which aims to promote international rulemaking on digital economy, especially on data flow and electronic commerce. Japan has been working together with partner countries to create the rules based on the concept of data free flow with trust, which is so-called DFFT. For example, by leading discussion in the WTO meeting for exploratory work on electronic commerce as co-conveners. In addition to the rulemaking, it is important to develop hard infrastructure in order to realize resilient supply chain. In the Indo-Pacific region, Japan has been supporting the construction of economic corridors by connecting countries with high-quality infrastructures in order to achieve development in the region as a whole. Since 2018, Japan has been collaborating with the United States and Australia in its support. At the G20 Osaka Summit, G20 Principles for Quality Infrastructure Investment was endorsed. It highlighted the importance of introducing clear rules, a solid system, and good governance, such as openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and debt sustainability in infrastructure investment. Japan considers it is important to work with other countries in the principle of multilateralism for enhancing a free trade regime, resilient supply chains, and creating rules based on DFFT. I look forward to an in-depth discussion in today's webinar, and I hope it will lead to Japan's further cooperation with Canada and other countries in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think we can learn a lot from Japan's leadership experience and wisdom on many of these issues. And I think this provides a perfect segue in many ways to some of the topics that we'll discuss today. I think you highlighted a number of them here, looking at Japan's role in the G20, also its role in leadership, which I think sometimes is taken for granted, but getting the TPP 11 across the finish line was a fundamentally difficult thing, and I think Japan's leadership in doing that, and now Canada as a member of that, is a very important element that I think we'll discuss a little bit more today. So thank you very much for those remarks, and I'd like to kind of move forward onto our panel. Another area that I think Japan has been very influential, but other member states, including Canada becoming a founding member, has been very much an important part of this region for a long time, is the Asian Development Bank, which I think doesn't necessarily get as much attention as it should. But on that note, and I should know that he's now retired, so I don't expect him to talk completely on the, as an official from the Asian Development Bank. But we have an expert joining us, Bart Édes, who I'll just briefly introduce. He's a former official for the Asian Development Bank. Currently, he has a number of interesting titles and distinguished titles. He's a distinguished fellow with the Asia-Pacific Foundation here in Canada. He's also has a affiliation with CSIS in Washington, D.C. And he's the author of a book called Learning from Tomorrow, Using Strategic Foresight to Prepare for the Next Big Disruption, which I think is extremely timely, Bart. So I know that that's a book that's going to be on my list to read this year as well. So Bart, happy to have your remarks, please.
Jonathan, thank you very much. And I do want to talk about the role of the multilateral development banks, including the one I just worked at for the last 20 years, the Asian Development Bank. But I first want to make a couple of points leading into that. The first one concerning Canada's trade. I mean, most of those online and tuning in today are in Canada or have a keen interest in Canadian trade and economic relations. So I want to talk a bit about diversification of Canada's trade and investment, and how that, as a second point, leads to Asia. And then I'll talk a bit about the MDBs, and I'll be rather succinct given we've got a panel to go through. So on the first point of diversification, as many of the listeners, those tuning in today know, about 70% of Canada's trade is with the United States. Canada is very dependent on the U.S. economy, and it kind of makes sense. The markets are heavily integrated, especially, for example, in the automotive sector. And frankly, for a lot of Canadian business, especially smaller and medium-sized enterprises, it's quite comfortable having such a large market, speaking English, geographically close right next door. But in the last 4 years, there's been a bit of a wake-up call about that kind of dependence. In August, just not that long ago, you had the U.S. administration saying that Canadian imports from Canada of aluminum were threatening to impair the national security of the United States. And then you had a change of administration quite recently, and one of the first things it did was cancel the Keystone XL pipeline and announce measures to promote procurement of U.S.-made goods and services. So this kind of comfort that's existed for many years of having a huge market right next door, with that comfort comes risk. And so the second point I really wanted to make was that in looking to get beyond reliance on one major market, Canada needs to move more aggressively toward pursuing opportunities in large and growing markets. And these markets are, for the most part, in Asia. You have government agencies at the federal and provincial level, like the Trade Commissioner Service, frankly, doing a great job. They're really working closely with business to identify opportunities and promote Canadian business abroad. But it hasn't really moved the needle that much thus far. When we think of Asia in terms of markets, oftentimes China comes to mind because it is such a large economy and continues to grow. In fact, it's one of the few economies in Asia or in the world that grew on a net basis in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. But it's not the only one. Vietnam and Taiwan, for example, those economies also grew in 2020. One of the things I'm watching in terms of looking beyond China for opportunities in Asia are the plans of the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. So the board manages some 430 billion Canadian dollars worth of pensions assets. And much of the investments that it carries out are in North America. Outside of Canada, the leading destination is perhaps obviously the US, but after the US, it's Asia. And it's interesting to note that between now and 2025, the Pension Plan Investment Board plans to make 1/3 of its investments in emerging markets, in particular in India, including in infrastructure, in real estate, and in public and private equities. I know that Yuka on the panel will talk a bit more about Japan, but let's also mention Korea. Korea was the first country Canada had a free trade agreement with going into effect in 2015. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had a major announcement of the Korean tech giant Naver, kind of a Google Plus within the Korean market, buying Wattpad, a social storytelling platform catering to the Gen Z generation, a $600 million investment from Korea in Canada. And if we look to Southeast Asia, to the 10 ASEAN countries, this is a massive market, 670 million people, booming middle class, 60% of the people there are under the age of 35. The top 5 developing countries in ASEAN grew about 5% a year in the last decade, 2010 to 2019. And by 2030, ASEAN is expected to be the 4th largest economy in the world. So one of the smart things that Canada has done recently, and the ambassador referred to this, was joining the CPTPP. And it was because of Japan's leadership in large part that this agreement came into being, and Canada joined early on. And 4 of the countries that are signatories, that are participants in this major agreement, are in ASEAN. And it's heartening to see that Canada is talking about a possible free trade agreement with ASEAN. And right now, the government is consulting on a potential Canada-Indonesia comprehensive economic partnership agreement. So this takes me to the multilateral development banks, which work in many of these countries. It was, Jonathan, you mentioned at the outset this big infrastructure need in Asia. And ADB itself has estimated that the annual need for infrastructure investments is about 1.7 trillion US dollars. This is between 2016 and 2030. So each year that's the need. And only about half of that is currently being met. And almost all of it, 90%, is from the public sector, including monies that some of the governments borrow from institutions like the one I used to work for, ADB. And when we talk infrastructure, we're thinking, for example, of water, of IT, of energy, of transport. Now, of the overall investment in infrastructure taking place, the multilateral development banks like ADB were financing about 2.5% a handful of years ago. If you take China and India out of the equation, it rises to 10%. And that sounds like a very small amount, and in a way it is, but the MDBs also lead by example. And the example they're leading by, for example, is providing very high standards and due diligence, well in line with the principles, the Osaka principles that the ambassador referred to. So taking seriously social and economic and environmental and governance aspects of projects. So and also the debt standing of countries, so as not to overload them with debt. So ADB and other actors, other multilateral development banks, and I point to the World Bank Group, the EBRD, which works in some of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and the newer Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. They are all playing a key role in providing sovereign loans to governments for infrastructure, but also they have private sector wings that are promoting private sector investment, which is really what's going to be needed to address this large gap. And I know in the case of ADB, it's greatly ramped up its work in the private sector. We've hired more staff. And you also see in the last couple of years, the IFC, the private sector wing of the World Bank Group, has received a capital increase, and some of that is being directed to Asia as well. And just to wind up, I want to mention Canada's role in all of this. So Canada is a founding member of ADB, of the World Bank, and of the EBRD, and it joined the AIIB within 2 or 3 years of the start of that new institution. At ADB, Canada is number 7 in terms of shareholding out of 68 countries, and in the last 8 years has contributed over 300 million Canadian dollars to a number of special funds that are addressing climate change and promoting private sector investment to address adaptation and mitigation, and also disaster risk management. So Canada has played a big role in ADB. It's also been active in some of these other development banks I'm talking about. Again, with the focus on ADB, since Canada joined at the outset in the mid-1960s, Canadian consultants, individuals and companies have won some 400 contracts for consulting and procurement worth some 170 US dollars. And so I'll just conclude by saying Canada is in there. They're in the both directly and in through these multilateral development banks that are upholding high standards of infrastructure investment, which the region desperately needs. It can do more. In the case of ADB, it's not individual consultants and procurement providers are not winning as many contracts as they could. If they look beyond North American continent and spend a little more time investing in Asia and taking advantage of government support programs and advice, they could have a bigger impact. And outside of the development banks, Canada could be teaming up more closely with Japan, with Australia, India, and the US in partnerships. You have, for example, the US proposal for a Blue Dot network, a certification scheme for infrastructure. It's not clear whether this will continue with the new administration, but in any case, there are various initiatives and funding programs, for example, in the energy sector, promoting investment in Southeast Asia and beyond, and Canada can play a bigger role in all this. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Bart. I mean, that was there's a lot of great information there to kind of distill on and to think about, and I think we'll kind of get a little bit to more of that during the moderated questions. But just very quickly, I mean, I thought you made a lot of excellent points. So one of the things I hadn't considered as much, I like the fact that you underscored that there's a lot that we can do within the Asian Development Bank, but also with the World Bank Group and EBRD. I think that's interesting. I think when people think of the region, they tend to think in terms of the Asian Development Bank and the new AIIB, but the idea that other more established players could also play a role there is very crucial. And I think I also like your overarching point, which has been a kind of a driver of our institute as Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative, is the idea that when we look at this region, it's broader than just Canada's engagement with China. Of course, China is a big market. There are opportunities there. There are risks there, as we know, but there are many, many other players in this region outside of China. I think that the ambassador obviously highlighted some of the benefits that Japan's providing to this region. I think you referenced Korea, and I think ASEAN is very crucial. And I think it's a nice segue to Amitendu, actually, because if we think about some of the key trade agreements that are established now in this region, sometimes I think the TPP, before it became an 11-member group, was seen as a US deal. And I think the RCEP often is seen as a China deal. But I think Amitendu knows very well that these are ASEAN origin, ASEAN focused deals that obviously involved at one point or other the big players. I think India was involved in RCEP until it decided it didn't want to be involved in RCEP. But I think it's important to remember that point, that ASEAN is central to both of these trade establishments. So this will segue us to our next panelist, who is Amitendu Palit, a great friend of mine, and he's a senior research fellow and research lead at the Institute of South Asian Studies in the National University of Singapore, which I had a great pleasure to visit. I believe it was last year, or time seems to have flown by so quickly now in the COVID era. But he has a great institute there in Singapore. And Amitendu also has a number of other roles and experiences. Most notably, he spent several years in the Ministry of Finance in the government of India. So he has both the perspective from being on the ground now in the ASEAN region, but also his long history of working in the Indian bureaucracy on trade and development issues. So Amitendu, I'll give the floor to you, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. A pleasure to be with you all today. And it's a great pleasure, actually, to be in a part of this conversation with the MLI. Thank you for inviting me to share the views. I think what I heard from my previous colleagues on the panel till now, both Ambassador Kawamura as well as Bart, have very clearly articulated the specifics that are driving the core granular issues involved in the subject that we are discussing today. So building up from there, they have alluded to the specific trade developments that have taken place in the region, the CPTPP, the RCEP. They have alluded to a series of developments that have come into the larger matrix of conversation around the Indo-Pacific today. I would like to bring to the table a few distinct points which I think are going to influence the way infrastructure shapes in this part of the world. And when I say in this part of the world, I do have primarily Asia on my mind, but I am trying to focus on it from a Canadian vantage point of view. I think one of the important changes that we need to note when we talk about infrastructure in Asia, and particularly from an outsider perspective, is that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the region that they encompass is an extremely heterogeneous region when it comes to capacities. And Bart alluded to this in a specific way, and his experience with the Asian Development Bank, he knows better than probably all of us, that the capacities with respect to infrastructure are very diverse across the region. And we have very, very, I would say, challenging perspective when it comes to addressing the infrastructure deficits in the region. And this, to a very large extent, had focused the way multilateral institutions and even individual country governments would address the issue of infrastructure. The focus was largely internal, and to a specific extent, it led to external engagements around the specific neighborhoods of countries, like, so for example, within the Southeast Asia region, or even within parts of Southeast Asia. Countries like Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos would look at infrastructure development or internal integration within them in a way which was somewhat different from countries like Malaysia or Indonesia, and of course Singapore, which were ahead in terms of institutional capacities. But this perspective has become a bit clouded of late because there has been a shift in the way infrastructure development is being addressed these days. The focus has moved on from traditional infrastructure capacities to the modern infrastructure capacities. And what I mean by the distinction between the two of them is that probably 7 to 8 years ago, the question of cyber connectivity, the question of digital integration between markets and communities was not as prominent in the region or in the Indo-Pacific as it is today. Because today, there's a clear realization that has come up that while land connectivity is important, but perhaps maritime connectivity is that much more important for a number of economies. But even more than maritime connectivity, perhaps economic benefits can be well and truly realized if the countries are connected through a cyber network, enabling greater inflow and outflow of cross-border transactions and exchanges. And to that extent, it's no longer easy for countries to actually focus on all elements of infrastructure development. They have to prioritize, and this is where the role of a country like Canada, which looks at building engagement, investment opportunities with the Indo-Pacific, becomes squarely important, because I think it's also important for Canada to prioritize in terms of what are the areas of infrastructure and in which of the countries does it intend to engage. To give you an example, there is a very interesting development that has happened in the region, which brings certain countries from across the Asia-Pacific. This is called the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which is taken off between Singapore, Brunei, and Chile, three small economies of the Asia-Pacific, all of them, interestingly, part of the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that was alluded to earlier. Now, what this probably means is that while countries are willing to become part of big trade agreements, humongous trade agreements, in order to benefit from the common rules of origin and trade facilitation which these agreements allow them, they're also willing to engage in much more selective spaces on specific issues. And let's say, for example, with respect to the digital economy, that would clearly enable them to focus on areas of cutting-edge advantage. Now, if one looks at this in the context of a higher demand for modern infrastructure, 21st century new generation infrastructure, then one also needs to note the fact that this realization has led to a distinct geopoliticization of the perspective of infrastructure in the region. This first happened with the emergence of the Belt and Road Initiative. There was no initiative which focused on this new generation focus on infrastructure connectivity in the region as prominently as the Belt and Road Initiative did. Now, once the Belt and Road Initiative brought the entire question of modern infrastructure and greater connectivity on the table, there were responses that came up. And these responses were articulated primarily through the United States in its Asia Reassurance Initiative Act that President Trump articulated in terms of the US vision of the Indo-Pacific, which also talks about rather in a focused and pointed fashion on the importance of investing in modern infrastructure, cutting-edge infrastructure, which really consolidates the ability of businesses to capture more dividends from knowledge-intensive areas. But the problem over here is that once countries step into this game, the question of national security also becomes prominent. Like, say, for example, on telecom infrastructure, which is an integral part of the digital infrastructure and cyber connectivity that countries and the regions are looking for. The question of national security can no longer be disconnected. And that then leads to another set of complications when countries start getting together on the question of common data rules or trade rules. Because while they understand the importance of coming together on this subject, they also understand the risks which greater integration creates in this regard. And that is the big challenge which this region is having to grapple with right now, which has been further complicated by COVID-19, because what COVID-19 has brought on for the countries is very interesting. COVID-19 has made it very clear that this pandemic or similar pandemics in future cannot be handled in isolation. It's important for countries to cooperate. And when it comes to cooperation, the cooperation is not just in terms of having similar strategies with respect to the public health systems, but most importantly, in terms of sharing information on how the pandemic is progressing, what's happening with respect to the development of vaccines, how these are being administered. And now that today the vaccines have become available, countries across Indo-Pacific have begun immunizing their population. The biggest challenge that has come up for the region is how to effectively create a logistics infrastructure that will enable the vaccines to move from one part of the region to another seamlessly. And most of it has to be integrated with the digital infrastructure capacities that the countries in the region have, because COVID-19 vaccine movement has to be seamless, has to be fast, and has to be effective. And in a number of cases, countries with low digital capacities are unable to handle this challenge. Now, this is again something where a country like Canada needs to actually visualize what's happening on ground, and probably it can have an extremely important constructive role to play as the vaccine game develops and as Canada's capacity in terms of looking closely at the region, in terms of the trade agreements, come on force. What I think I would further mention in two of my last points is it's very interesting that along with COVID-19, along with geopoliticization of the infrastructure rush, Asia-Pacific and countries of Indo-Pacific at large, and particularly those which are part of Asia, has not actually given up on trade as compared with the Atlantic part of the world, where a large number of trade restrictions and export restrictions came up in the wake of COVID-19. Export restrictions in Asia have been much few, and by and large, Southeast Asia and the region has remained committed to a free trade agenda. And that is clearly visible from the passage of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That is clearly visible from standalone bilateral trade agreements that have either been finished or are being worked upon, like, say, for example, the UK-Japan Partnership Agreement, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, and the various agreements that ASEAN is engaged with, and finally the CPTPP. Now, today, the CPTPP presents a host of exciting possibilities, particularly when one looks at it in the background of the fact that there is a new United States administration. That administration might want to recommit itself to the CPTPP. But in the meantime, a number of substantive geopolitical changes have taken place in the region, which have actually included a country like China, which previously looked at CPTPP with a great degree of suspicion, now expressing an interest to join the CPTPP. And there have also been occasions where Taiwan has expressed an interest to join the CPTPP. So it's going to be a very interesting but complicated way of looking at trade. But what I wanted to end on with is the fact that while there are these very major shifts that have taken place in the perspective towards infrastructure building in the region, and while there have been trade activities that have gone on in terms of institutional trade agreements, the point that we must note very carefully is that there's a great degree of radical reordering which is happening in Asia. And that's primarily in terms of the repositioning of supply chains. Ambassador Kawamura alluded to the resilient supply chain initiative which Japan, China, and Australia have taken up. There are also other similar focuses that are going on in terms of making the regional supply chains less prone to disruption and widening the basket of procurement for individual countries. But I think it's important to note that to a very large extent, this is a push coming from a geopolitical perspective. There is a geopolitical urge to fix this push and take the production out of China to the extent possible. Now, there is a certain geopolitical rationale to it, because there is this sentiment, this anxiety that China has been consistently weaponizing the economic interdependence it has with a large number of countries in the region, including with the rest of them. But the question is this a sentiment which is also shared by businesses? I think that's the key point which will drive the future focus on infrastructure, investment, and trade relationships in the region. Does the geopolitical perspective lead to a similar enthusiasm on part of business, particularly private business? Because a country like Canada will need to bring that on the table to its investors and check with them whether this consistently converges between two sides of the spectrum, the political side and the business side. I'll end here.
Well, thank you so much, Amitendu. I think there's a lot of great points there to think on. In particular, I think it was very interesting that you brought up the digital economics side, which I think is going to be very, very important, and I think is a good segue to our next panelist. And I think the other really important point you brought on was the importance to work together, and how this interconnects with the digital side in the post-COVID-19 world. So I think both of these points were very important. And one thing I think that we can kind of connect a little bit more on question time is the importance that when we think about countries that we should be engaging in, and particularly I'm thinking about Canada in this regard. I think you referenced ASEAN, but you also noted the particular bilateral countries that would provide opportunities for us. And within those bilateral countries, what would be the specific sectors or areas? I think that's very important to kind of think a little more granularly on where our interests are, where our strengths are. So those are all great points. I'd like to move on now to our next panelist, who is coming to us from Tokyo, Miss Yuka Koshino. Yuka is a research fellow right now for Japan Security and Defense Policy with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She's one of Japan's best emerging scholars on the sort of intersection between national security and economic governance issues, economic statecraft issues. Before joining IISS and the Japan chair there, she was at another Japan chair with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Yuka, we're delighted to have you, and please.
Thank you very much for a very kind introduction, Jonathan, and for inviting me to this online event on a very important topic. I feel grateful and honored to join such a distinguished group of experts today and to speak after Ambassador Kawamura's excellent and very comprehensive and informative speech on Japan's approach to regional connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region. So unlike the other speakers, I am not an economist or I don't have experience in development financing, but today I hope to contribute to the discussion by focusing on the security and the strategic dimension of regional connectivity, with a focus on digital infrastructure and digital economy as well, and to discuss why there's a growing need for like-minded partners like Japan and Canada to cooperate in promoting net connectivity with rules-based liberal order in the Indo-Pacific region. I have three very brief points today for my opening remarks. So my first point is that the Indo-Pacific region is the engine of global economy in the 21st century, like Amitendu has just described, and is becoming increasingly so as the world's fastest growing digital economy. The region has the fastest growing digital population driven by the young digital native population. And the region is also rapidly digitalizing its economy and society by adopting technologies brought about by the fourth industrial revolution, like 5G, artificial intelligence, big data, and IoT and robotics, to meet its economic and social development goals. And the region is also driving the digital innovation because of that. My second point is that we still see gaps in governance, rules, and norms in digital space. And that is why the digital infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region, which will serve as the important backbone of this future global economy, has become the center of geopolitical competition between China and the United States. Most importantly, Chinese digital technologies like 5G and e-commerce and payment systems and smart cities have rapidly spread across the region under President Xi Jinping's Digital Silk Road project, which is the digital dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative, that has become increasingly apparent over the last several years, providing, and these developed through the government's provision of massive funding supports and regulatory supports. And this raises security, economic, and political concerns for Japan, Canada, and like-minded countries. Chinese firms' links, for example, with the state through the Chinese intelligence law raises questions over the security and reliability of this very important digital backbone of the economy. And unfair lending practices undermines the rules-based, free, open, and fair economic order and competition in the region. And the spread of Chinese technologies is also spreading the Chinese model of a more of an authoritarian taste of the governance, raising questions around data protectionism or democratic values and even human rights abuses through the spread of massive state surveillance technologies. My final point is that Japan, the United States, or any other countries, like-minded countries, cannot meet these challenges alone. And the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, which the ambassador have laid out in great detail, has already served and has developed into a very useful economic construct, inclusive construct over the past years to mobilize the like-minded countries to respond to these challenges through a rules-based approach. Digital connectivity, for instance, is a key pillar of this free and open Indo-Pacific vision proposed by Japan and also shared under the shared visions of the free and open Indo-Pacific between the United States and Japan. And as the ambassador has mentioned, Japan's also launched the Osaka track to promote the rules making in the field of e-commerce through the concept of the DFFT. And also, if you look at the region, Australia, India, and Southeast Asia have also embraced the principles of the free and open Indo-Pacific, although maybe the countries might not be exactly using the phrase FOIP. More importantly, countries beyond the region, like have begun to uphold this approach, such as United Kingdom and France and Germany and Netherlands have all launched this free Indo-Pacific policies embracing these principles. And while there were questions about the longevity of this FOIP under the leadership transitions over the past several months, for instance, in Japan, the Prime Minister Suga has committed, as soon as he assumed office, to continue the FOIP and committed to the region as an Indo-Pacific nation during his first foreign visits to Vietnam and Indonesia last year. And there is also increased opportunity and momentum for U.S. leadership role in upholding rules-based economic order in the region. The new Biden administration senior officials over the past several days have agreed to cooperate under the free and open, to achieve a free and open Indo-Pacific with the Japanese counterpart. And it is more willing to take part in regional multilateral forums, such as the East Asia Summit, which the Trump administration has often skipped during his presidency. So with the absence of a U.S. leadership role to fill in the gap over the past several years under the Trump administration, and the regional and China's increasing willingness to take on that leadership role to shape the governance and roles and norms in this region, there is a growing importance for cooperation between like-minded partners like Canada and Japan to play in this region in the world. So I very much look forward to continuing the discussion today. And thank you very much again for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much, Yuka. That's very interesting discussion on Japan's approach to FOIP, but also the intersection with digital connectivity. And I think you brought up a really important point at the end when talking about multilateral architecture and why, while it's a necessary kind of condition, it's not always a sufficient condition. And I think this is something that myself and others, I think at the Institute, have argued that there are many different ways, many different vehicles of engagement that I think like-minded states will need to be driving to pursue their interests on this area. And I think the current multilateral architecture is one of them, but I think working together with like-minded countries, and Japan obviously being one of the first and foremost in my mind, will be an important element. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll talk more to question time. So I'd like to kind of now bring to our last panelist, and last but definitely not least is our Canadian friend here, Dan Ciuriak. And Dan has many affiliations and roles. I think you have more than my baseball card set when I was a kid. but it's a testament to what an authority Dan is on trade, investment, and finance issues. Just to kind of list off a couple, he is director and principal of Ciuriak Consulting Incorporated. He's a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, in addition to being a fellow at C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, along with the Asia Pacific Foundation in Vancouver, and the BKP, Development Research and Consulting Institute in Munich, Germany. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Perfect. So this is thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to be on this panel. And of course, after the great presentations by Ambassador Kawamura, Bart, and Amitendu and Yuka, I don't feel like I'm hitting cleanup. I think I'm adding a few footnotes to what they've already laid on the table, but I'll try and add a little bit to it. I would focus on underscoring two particular risks. There are two things which are moving big time right now. One of them is economic geography, and the other one is technology. So with the CETA and the CPTPP and the CUSMA in place, we could think of Canada as being in the center of gravity of the world trading system, safely embedded in a multilateral framework in which goods were, quote unquote, made in the world by global value chains. But the Indo-Pacific framing, which is actually at the heart of a broader re-emergence of an Afro-Eurasian trading system, which was the dominant system prior to the industrial era, and which is centered on East Asia, things feel a bit different. Canada does not have trade agreements with the three large population, high growth economies in this system, which is China, India, and the ASEAN 10. As Bart said, the US is looking inward now. Japan, which anchors the CPTPP, is now part of RCEP, which draws it west and south for production links and markets. Meanwhile, the European Union is looking east with its investment agreement with China. And this is actually accentuated by the splintering caused by Brexit, because the UK, which is Canada's largest trading partner in the EU, is now outside and looking west to the United States. So in economic geography terms, the economic tectonic plates are moving, and Canada is now starting to look distant from the world's center of gravity. And we tend to mention that we have to revisualize our place in the world. And I think this is a very important thing for us to absorb and reflect upon. The second major risk concerns technology. So the trade agreements that we have made were optimized for an era shaped by the industrial knowledge-based economy era. This is the world of global value chains. Since around 2010, we have entered the data-driven economy era. And this is the result of key technological breakthroughs in the 2000s, the introduction of the iPhone, which triggered the mobile era and an explosion of data, breakthroughs in neural net technology, and the application of massively parallel computer chips to optimize these neural nets. And this resulted in the powering of artificial intelligence through machine learning. So make no mistake, we are in a very new technological era. The digital transformation that this is powering is now moving very swiftly, and it's accelerated by the pandemic. So what does this mean for Canada? Well, in the first instance, there are no oceans or littorals in cyberspace. Canada is not necessarily now outside of this system and the new antipodes to the new Afro-Eurasian or Indo-Pacific system. The trade agreement that may be most critical for Canada going forward may be the DIPA, as Amitendu emphasized. But there are major issues to be addressed in keeping the flow of data going. Free flow with trust, as per the G20 proposal that was developed during Japan's year as chair of the G20, is threatened by national security and sovereignty concerns. The DIPA actually is very thin in terms of how to regulate, how to deal with this economy. The infrastructure that shapes connectivity in digital space is undersea cables and satellites. And these systems are now subject to fragmentation along security lines. So we have China has its Baidu system. The US has GPS. The Europeans have the Galileo system. And when we think about the undersea cables, the major powers are moving to exclude each other from laying them because they want to be certain about the security of the flow of information through these cables. So Canada's disadvantages in this particular new economy are we have no production capacity, particularly in the hardware side of the economy. We really miss Nortel. The second thing is that the digital economy is a world of superstar firms. And these are now concentrated in Northeast Asia. China, with 126 Fortune 500 firms, is now actually more than the United States. And then there's Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. All of them are major centers for these large firms. These draw energy and scale from the integrated Northeast Asian economy, and RCEP will work to further deepen these networks. So technological decoupling, which is raised by the security side, could cripple our ability to gain a foothold in the digital economy of the future. By the way, in today's news, I see that US firms are voicing the same fear. So whether Canada's economic and trade strategy, Wayne Gretzky, a famous Canadian hockey player, once famously said, the secret was to move to where the puck was going. Well, we have technological and economic geographic tectonic plates are moving. We need to move towards the new center of gravity. We have to visualize how we fit in the world. And this will take us, as a number of speakers have said before me, towards prioritizing our linkages, in particular, right in the first instance to ASEAN, which seems the most promising market for a new free trade agreement. But in general, Canada has to find its way in the digital economy space in this brave new world of the future. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Dan. I think those are really helpful comments and really kind of helps us circle this conversation. I think it complemented very well with Yuka's remarks. And just a couple points before we kind of get to the moderated discussion. But I think it's really important to kind of talk about some of the disruptive technologies, but also some of the, as you said, the new economy, and I think our need to adapt. And a couple of points on the regional side, I think that, and this sort of, I think, was reinforced by a couple of your prior panelists, was the need for us to think not only beyond Northeast Asia, where I think, we have important relationships in Northeast Asia. I think there's 2 points here. We need to think, I wouldn't say it's just moving from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia. I think it's within Northeast Asia. I think we need to be thinking a little bit differently too. And I noticed yourself and Bart and others had referenced working more closely with Taiwan and South Korea, and obviously Japan has been brought up. So I think that this is not to say that we shouldn't look for opportunities to engage with China, but I think all of the panelists brought up the point that I think there's a bigger piece of pie and potentially much more easier partners to work with in that region that we should be looking at, in addition to strengthening our ties with countries in ASEAN and India. So a great set of remarks.